quickly than us. So here we are learning to see the development of AI. But and probably the AI will change the way we think about democracy, because it's easy to get to produce fake news, after the fake information. So those people who are able to be in charge of the AI might be able to have stronger voice under some certain circumstances. So I think here today we are coming to learn together and to see and exchange ideas about everything relating to our probably new human existence and the social development and so on. So I'm looking forward to the coming discussion, and I hope that all of you could exchange ideas, and if you have a little bit of time, you could explore Taipei and probably try to find some food to enjoy yourself after the long day. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for your kind words. Okay, now let's begin our first forum, which is titled Higher Education and Anti-Thoughts. We have 5 speakers for this forum. So first of all, let me I'll give a short introduction to all of them. Our first speaker is Dr. Agus Suwignyo. The Professor Suwignyo is an associate professor in Indonesian history. Well, I forgot one thing. I have to remind the audience that we are tape recording the 2 forums. So if we publish the videos on the internet, we will blur the audience's images. But if you make remarks, if you speak and you do not want your remarks to be published on the videos on the internet, you please tell our staff. We will take that part away. Okay, I'm sorry, Agus. Let me continue. Okay. So Professor Suwignyo is Associate Professor in Indonesian History affiliated with the History Department, Universitas Gadjah Mada, Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He received his doctoral degree from Leiden University, the Netherlands, in 2012. He did postdoctoral research at KITLV Leiden and Tokyo University, and Friars University of Freiburg, and the University of Agder in Kristiansand, successfully in 2013 and 2014, and also from 2014 to 2015, and also 2016. His publications include the areas of social and educational history of the 20th century Indonesia. Okay, and our second speaker is Dr. Bregham. Okay, Dr. Dalgliesh, Professor Dalgliesh commenced his studies in Cape Town and continued at British Columbia in Edinburgh for MA and PhD degrees. He taught in France from 2002 to 2011, where he remains as associate researcher at the Institute Min Telecom in the LASCO Idea Lab. In 2012, he joined the faculty of the University of Tokyo. His philosophical point of departure is critique, broadly construed as the duty to make the will, to know conscious of itself as the problem. Okay, and our third speaker is Dr. Anirban Gupta Nigam. Okay, Dr. Nigam is the Associate Director of the Institute for South Asia Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His work has appeared in values like Theory, Culture and Society, and Bioscope, South Asian Screen and Studies, and Theory and Text. And our next speaker is Dr. Hitomi Koyama. Dr. Koyama is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Humanities, Leiden University, the Netherlands. She is an international relations theorist working at the intersection of comparative political theory, global intellectual history, and discourses, Asianism, in Japanese international political thoughts. The first book on the persistence of the Japanese history problem, Historicism and the International Politics of History, published in Routledge, year of 2018. In the book, she asks why post-war Japanese society remains caught in an impasse over atonement for its imperialist past. Her most recent publication is Supposing the Moral States, Japan and Historical Justice under Liberal Internationalism, published in International Affairs Journal. Okay, and our last speaker is a colleague in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures, Dr. Bing Da Gu. Okay, Dr. Gu is an Associate Professor of Foreign Language and Literatures at National Taiwan University, Taiwan here. He received his PhD from University College London in 2014. He is now working on a monograph project entitled Mais Architectures, La Bécété de Littérature and Writing Architecture. Okay, thank you very much. Now let's give a big round of applause to our speakers. Okay, Agus.
Very good morning to you, and yes, thank you. The title of my talk is long, but my slide is short. Don't worry about it. Does the use of AI in higher education redefine the concept of knowledge decolonization? This is I'm really posing you a question, so I'm not going to provide any answer to it, but to start simulating about it by my question. This is the readings that I've been using, and decolonizations of knowledge, epistemicide, participatory research in higher education, and the second one is on the basic concepts of decolonizations in higher education. I'm grateful, very much grateful to the speakers in the today's conference that we have had here. All the speeches are very inspiring, but I found particularly 3 of them very relevant to the talk that I'm going to do today. That's by John Xiao on redefine or divine and rule, data colonialism, indigenous data sovereignty, and virtual epistemicide, and Chia Yang history on the why social science matters for LLM diversity, and by Joe Bradley on the ultra-city. And then I'm really grateful once again and for these 3 speakers in particular. I would like to start with some text from the reading. Modern universities from their very beginnings were complicit in and benefited from colonization and racialization. Many Western institutions were also deeply involved in the colonial cataloging of non-Western knowledges and the production of knowledge in support of scientific racism and other racialized and colonial classifications used to justify forcible assimilation, military occupation, and even annihilation of non-white populations. As a result, some have suggested that the emergence and eventual dominance of the modern Western secularized and supposedly universal episteme of mode of knowledge was only made possible in the context of Europe's projects of conquest and enslavement. A constitutive paradox of the colonial constructions of knowledge therefore haunts any effort to decolonize existing institutions. That is, claims about the universality of Western knowledge can only be sustained in contrast to the partiality of non-Western knowledges. This particular part of the readings really strike me. I will combine it with the second reading a little bit, and then what is generally understood as a knowledge in the universities of our world represents a very small proportion of the global treasury of knowledge. University knowledge systems in nearly every part of the world are derivations of the Western canon, the knowledge system created some 500 years ago in Europe by white male scientists. The contemporary university is often characterized as working with colonized knowledge, hence the increasing cost for the decolonizations of our universities. The epistemologies of most peoples of the world, whether indigenous or excluded on the basis of race, gender, and sexuality, are missing. But evidence of other epistemologies and other ways of representing knowledge exists without much deeper analysis of whose knowledge, how that knowledge was gathered, and how transformative change is encouraged through deeper attention to knowledge democracy. Public engagement in the knowledge sharing simply reinforces the existing colonized relations of knowledge power. So it's very strong words that the author are using here. My comments on the two readings, the notion of colonization of knowledge and the decolonization necessary of it, while still holding to in a sense, is running out of contextuality as it is very 20th century in context, and also very advanced in paradigm. And I'm going to start by these 2 points in weighing and calculating and how relevant those statements still is in the current state of the art of AI development and the influence of AI-driven higher education. So, okay, maybe the questions would be, to what extent can colonization and decolonization concept of Orientalized 20th century sustain in higher educations of the AI-driven 21st century? And we are just starting with the maybe sort of a schema, hypothetical schema. I'm starting by trading, so timeline is really important in my study, you know. So I kind of making imaginary new time war. So colonizations of knowledge in the pre-AI era, and then colonizations of knowledge in the AI-driven era, how they would change, transform, or maybe even alter the other format. And also the decolonization in each of the era. And I'm going to start with this pre-AI, and then to pose it with some kind of hypothetical data here. This one is the experience of Indonesia in particular, but also in developing countries, because the former colonial countries, because the reading that I provide you is also based on the experiences of developing countries, especially in Africa and in Latin America. So we talk about the historical cases here, how pre-AI colonizations of knowledge and the decolonizations that emerge thereafter. We can have some aspects of analysis on the time, on the actors, on the object of characterization, purpose of use and use of knowledge, the nature of concept of colonization, the mode of operation and main features, and so on. So the traditional concept of coloniality would deal with a certain period of time of the 16th century after the Second World War. And then the actors usually is pointed as Europeans and Japanese entities. And then objects of this action would be indigenous commoners. And the purpose was cultural genocide, linguisticide, and epistemicide. And nature of concept would be dispossessions of the indigenous knowledge system. Thank you. And then also hegemonizing Western knowledge, but asymmetric access to it. So pushing downward the indigenous knowledge system, but then raising the Western knowledge system, however, with very restricted access to the Western system. And mode of operation is usually race-based, language-based policies. And this is where I think divide and rule is really, by Li Wei-Chuan-Xiu, is really applicable to see that divide and rule of that. The main features of national superiority. And the decolonization of it would be really the nationalistic way of seeing things. So replacement of European elite by indigenous elite, but not necessarily going to the commoners. So this is from elite to elite transitions of power of knowledge production. So just uninstalling the European and replace it with the indigenous elite, and you are becoming a new nation with new knowledge, new sovereignty of knowledge production. So the main features would be nation independence. And this was the case with Indonesia from the first half of the 20th century. But then, by the emergence of nation state, a new type of coloniality emerges, also in the forms of domination. This time, the domination is the state. The dominant power is the state in the process of defining what knowledge should be in the higher education system. So, national integration, hegemonic asymmetric access to knowledge, usually become the major concept of coloniality in the second session of this part. So I will skip it because then the second coloniality also then invited new decolonization type with the epistemic society in the making. And now we come to this AI-driven colonization and decolonization of knowledge. This is a table in the making, and I'm really, as I said earlier, this is more question than answer. So there are some blank columns here. What does it mean by coloniality in the era of AI-driven higher education? Does it refer to Silicon Valley as an actor? But what is Silicon Valley? Who's there? And cannot simply identify any classical identifier or categorizations of colonialism. Race, nation, gender, religion are not necessary factors here. Okay, thank you. And then the purpose as epistemicide, but in what sense? Yesterday we talked about the participation, and I am very much inspired by Chia Li-yang, the problem of participation as problem of representation yesterday. AI is also providing us with possibility of participation, but in what sense? So this is a case from this year conference in Bandung, Indonesia. Someone was asking ChatGPT about the same questions with same linguistic construction. Do Israelis have the right to sovereign state, and do Palestinians have the right to sovereign state? And the answer to the questions completely different. Only one, the linguistic construction is the same. Only Israelis and Palestinians are different key here, but the answer is completely different. So last slide is that we might need to think again, back to the reading, multiple epistemologies, ways of knowing, organic, spiritual, land-based, American, but also multiple forms, text, image, number, story, music, drama, poetry, ceremony, meditation as the forms of knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Agus. And then our next speaker, Dr. Dalgliesh Bregham.
Okay, so forgive my voice, I've kind of lost it along the way somewhere, so I'll try and speak as clearly as I can. As you can see, Acaeugenics, the Pariah stranger as a purveyor for Organisational Symbiogenesis, quite a mouthful. I want to take you, yesterday Gadjah Sensei spoke about the paintings in the canteen at the University of Tokyo, so I want to take you a bit further into the belly of the university with a discussion on AI, academic inbreeding. So, and I'm making an analogy with genetics here. So, we know that genetic variability in biology is the reason behind the survival of species. In Homo sapiens, relative homozygotic species survive because of the heterozygosity, the diversity of their subpopulations, their cultures, their people. The political takeaway is that molecular diversity ensures molar survival, and I suppose a larger point from Lewontin is that race is a figment or a pigment of imagination. So my lesson here for academia, does the survival of the species of scholar, indulge me if you will, the species of scholar, depend on the diverse expression of their academic genes? Again, something like analytic and skeptic, by local learned communities worldwide? Well, I would want to answer yes and suggest that there's some problems in some universities. So the paradox of internationalization then would be what happens when universities have practiced academic inbreeding, and I'll define this in a minute. Typically state-funded, national, state or public, depending on the country you're in, pursue what Simon Marginson calls global research university status to play inside the commercial internationalization of education. So let me come back to a very simple definition of academic inbreeding. It's the preference for hiring candidates from the same institution. In the words of Hugo Horta, who's developed this notion quite thoroughly, he speaks of pure inbred, so typically faculty with a PhD who then merge into, students with a PhD who merge into a faculty position. He also talks about partial inbred, so people who may have had a degree elsewhere from the university where they work, all silver-corded. Faculty typically do a PhD at National University of Taiwan, for example, are farmed out or delocalized to a small university and then come back in a few years later to where they got their PhD. There are exceptions to these. In Korea and Russia, for example, it's crucial to have your bachelor's before you get a position at the university, generally. And Horta speaks of a 4-stage process in Japan where it's quite common to have your bachelor, master, PhD, and then merge into a faculty position. There might be cultural imperatives behind this in sort of socially connected patron-client relations sort of societies. It's a chance to keep organizational culture under control. And it's also something we find more in ancient as opposed to newer universities. I'll just draw your attention to the bottom graph here. It's speaking about the levels of academic inbreeding across several countries. The darker purple graph is the level of academic inbreeding in all universities in the country, and the lighter purple shade is that in the more prestigious institutions, which backs up the point I said earlier. So you can see in places like Russia, Spain, Ukraine, they sort of parallel each other. It's across the board, whereas in Japan or South Africa, the average is below that of the more prestigious universities. So academic inbreeding, I want to argue, is a commercial dead end. Again, quoting Horta, it leads to maintaining the status quo, emphasizing organizational identity and traditions, perpetuating the belief that the way of doing things in the past will work in the present. So, eugenics, as we know, is this sort of ideological arm of genetics. In Galton's famous phrase, it's about well-born stock with noble qualities and perpetuating them. And we also know that in the 20th century it led to various politics of euthanasia in the extreme, forced sterilization, laws against miscegenation, and ultimately marginalization of so-called mongrel populations, those who weren't purely inbred. So when does academic inbreeding descend into Acaeugenics? I want to argue it's when there's a preference for recruiting pure inbred faculty, those with a PhD from the university who become faculty at the university, and they also have the same nationality of where the university is located. This is not a new phenomenon. I just referred to the University of Bologna in the 13th century when it became very widespread, very famous. The faculty asked the city of Bologna to restrict management and chair positions to Bolognese citizens only, which they obliged. And then they realized that the families were passing the chairs on from father to son, and tried to break that monopoly, but were not successful. So disclosing this practice of academic eugenics is kind of a little bit of a personal journey, and I've written an autoethnography about this. It's essentially when what I call trans scholars, and I can come back to that, I'm not referring to transgender, but to trans scholars as in people who go across and question and put in and problematize boundaries, when they are moved into or recruited into academic life from outside the country and then are excluded from the standard privileges and normal sort of everyday academic life we would expect. And in this sense, academic eugenics is ethically unviable. Back to the biological analogy, it leads to inbreeding depression, which is essentially the recipe for the extinction of a species. And within the university, I argue it leads to ethical denigration, basically exclusion of the so-called trans scholar. As Borenstein argue, it leads to, Borenstein et al., nepotism, parochialism, cronyism, favoritism, and discrimination. Of course, there are caveats to making this critique. non-inbred trans scholars are a drop in the ocean. If we classify them as migrants, people who move abroad for a more longer period of work, they only make up 9% of academics. This is from a study of over 25,000 faculty across the world. Of course, crossbreeding is also the exception. It might be a necessity in countries with a limited pool of academic resources like Singapore, or qualified faculty, or obviously it's something that the big players engage in, like the US and Australia. And crossbreeding may even be a little bit of a colonial venture. It's something that arises in the Anglophone world of the USA in the early 20th century, when there were sort of high rates of inbreeding in Harvard, and by the end of the century those rates had been reduced to 88%. So, sorry, in non-inbreds, crossbreeding had taken place. So let me then focus on academic inbreeding in Japan. At Japanese national universities, it's the highest. That goes back to my slide earlier of the most prestigious universities. I'm homing in here on the Acaeugenics at the University of Tokyo, mainly because it's a prestigious university, the most prestigious in Japan by many accounts, as you can see from the people I've quoted. It crowns the academic hierarchy. It's the pillar of Japanese national universities and recruits the best students. You can also see Todai, as it's commonly called, personifies global higher education in the commercial mode. It recently committed what you might call symbolic seppuku by getting rid of Japanese kanji from its title altogether. It's no longer called a logo, but a visual identity, which was fashioned by an executive vice president who is also the director of marketing for Google in Asia and Japan. So the levels of academic eugenics at Todai are fairly high, second only to Kyoto University, and in law it's 83%. I just compared that with 23% at Osaka, for example, or Humanities 69% versus 32% in Hokkaido. So it almost seems as if the University of Tokyo and Kyoto are a little bit exceptional here. And of course there's also a gendered derivative of this Acaeugenics, which I won't go into but can come back to if you like in the interest of time. So symbiogenesis biologically is about the co-constitution of entities, of kinds from cells to genomes. It's something that John Haraway picks up from Margulies. And I want to just use that metaphor of strangers making with each other to argue that that might be a useful metaphor for trans scholars in academia. So let me just skip a few slides and go straight to, so Hannah Arendt was the text, the Jew as Pariah. There are some common themes in that text about modern society stigmatizing Jews historically and modern European society. There's also the issue there of the pariah excluded from the key realm for Arendt of the political. There's also the idea of valorizing thinking as a form of resistance, and obviously to diffuse totalitarianism that she comes to later. And I think there's also an imperative here from Arendt in the text of you cannot hide or stay silent from power. You need to obviously think it in order to have the courage to engage with it. On that basis, she gives us four figures of the pariah: the poet, the rebel, the little man, and the good pariah. The first three categories withdraw from a modern society and exist in a sort of a world of authentic freedom in nature for the poet. The rebel doesn't have the courage to rebel against anti-Semitism. The little man, the idea of Charlie Chaplin she talks about, is using charitable handouts and he's a hustler in urban society. But again, that is not enough, especially when totalitarianism comes knocking at the door and even the very marginal position of the pariah is no longer viable. So what Arendt is saying is there's no protection in heaven or earth against bear, that's her words, Zoe, perhaps we could say murder. The Jew as parvenu, the one who is co-opted and assimilates, perhaps like many international scholar, and the pariah who voluntarily stands aside. Neither of these positions are viable. Sorry, I didn't give you the slide I was speaking from. Arendt sees some virtue in the good pariah because they try to stand back from an anti-Semitic politics, but in a bureaucratic totalitarian society. eventually their belief in basic human rights are compromised. But there is a legacy from this figure in trying to agitate for basic rights to life, maybe, again, we call that Zoe, as well as liberty, work and action in Arendt's vocabulary. We have a recipe for action in the future. So I want to finally, and this is my last slide, argue that what we might take from this is that the trans scholar is a pariah figure in global research universities. What they do is expose the ethical paradox of national universities trying to internationalize, but without denationalizing their Acaeugenic and fairly nationally oriented organizational culture. If we play by the rules of the Anglosphere and commercial internationalization, this will go on and nothing will change because there is no ethical imperative in commercial internationalization. However, if we take an ethical approach to internationalization and use Arendt's idea of trying to agitate for change, then we can paraphrase her quotation as I have at the bottom and say, only within the institution of higher education can trans scholars live as scholars amongst their species without exhausting themselves from ethically fighting over the politics of Acaeugenics. Only when scholars live in consort, so it's not something easy, it's a conflictual relationship with other scholars, namely non-inbred scholars, the pariah, and perhaps accord them an unconditional Derridian hospitality and engage in making with each other, can they hope to establish a commonly conditioned and no longer commercial version of internationalization. And perhaps this forum here of a cross-breeding of ideas is sort of a model to think of in this respect. Thank you.
And our next speaker is Dr. Gadjah.
I want to start by thanking Hung-chiung and Ning and Rex and the entire team for the extravagant and wonderful 3 days, and all the other participants for a lot of threads that have been coming up that refract through what I have to say. I'm going to take either a few seconds under 10 or a few seconds over 10, depending on how I pace myself. And I'm going to try and read so I can be careful with my words. My comments today are informed by 2 questions about right-wing politics that have been nagging me for a while. The first is, why does the right's aversion to social heterogeneity manifest as its defense in the realm of thinking? And the second is, why does the accusation of something like hypocrisy fail to dent this form of politics despite its obvious accuracy? The answers I offer are very tentative and I'm open to all forms of corrections, and take a step back from the immediacy of the scene to inquire into the intellectual mechanisms that authorize this kind of politics. Racist and majoritarian thought is often debunked on the grounds of ahistoricism or weak sociology. Its resilience points to the possibility that it does not derive legitimacy from history, nor is its appeal made to history. Its articulation as cultural injury that can be historicized, America before immigration, India before Islam, obscures its metaphysical commitments. Following Nahum Chandler, we can say that these philosophies mask a metaphysical antagonism oriented specifically towards others, and generally towards the concept and fact of heterogeneity itself. Attending to what Chandler calls this metaphysical infrastructure allows us to, quote, think xenophobic discourse from within the possibility of its own commitments. This is also the region that I think Lucius Outlaw draws attention to in the text that I assigned, when he writes of education as the primary site where, quote, the terms and agenda of social ordering are mediated to successive generations. The keyword here, I think, is mediation, which the late intellectual historian J.G.A. Pocock identified as among the more damaging contributions of politics to modern life. In his 1975 book, The Machiavellian Moment, Pocock argued that representative democracy fictionalizes politics by mediating the relationship between citizen and state through institutions and representatives. To this, theorists like Hortense Quillas, Mahmoud Mamdani, and Talal Asad have added that liberal democracies A, politicize group identity to secure individual belonging, and B, demolish personality and specificity in favor of a politics where any 2 entities can be made equivalent to each other through a principle like one citizen, one vote. Indeed, liberal democracy is governed by the logic of equivalence, not equality, which is a condition that historically had to be secured. Perhaps nowhere is mediation as the condition of accessing the world, as the condition of accessing the concepts necessary for making sense of the world, clearer than in the sphere of education. Teaching and learning are not, I think, inherently hierarchical processes, but they are inherently exercises in trust and the responsible uses of power. Education is not then just about getting the facts right, but developing the capacities to make judgments and decisions about fact and value in every instance where they arise. An education worth its name teaches the proper use of concepts, not which concepts are the most proper to use. In this sense, to become educated is as much to enter into knowledge as it is to accept the limits of what one can or needs to know. My basic contention is that American right-wing politics and thinking is expressed as a fear and skepticism of mediation and heterogeneity, both of which are seen as destructive to the coherence and integrity of the individual, and by extension, the wider community. Politically, such phobia manifests as the defense of settler power against what Manisha Sinha calls the project of interracial democracy. I want to say something about the conceptual underpinnings of this project. We can start by noting that the world before post-truth did not necessarily hold because of a collective investment in fact and evidence. Modern authority, which spoke the language of expertise, did not convert publics to cultures of fact. Rather, it privatized irrationalities, relegating them to the fringes of or outside the public. Disinformation, then, doesn't necessarily indicate a sudden collapse of public faith in evidence, so much as the erosion of a worldview grounded in the authority of experts. Coined in the image of science and expertise, all modern forms of power, liberal and illiberal alike, saw the world as a problem knowledge could solve. In a way, it is the ruins of this arrangement we are left to make sense of today. One person eager to help is US Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. In a 2020 essay, Vance wrote reflectively about his conversion to Catholicism. Threaded by autobiographical stories explaining his awakening, the text inhabits precisely the space I've been trying to draw out. One of the stories he relates is from his time as a student at the Ohio State University, where Vance had to read about a philosophical debate on the nature of belief. One participant in the debate, Basil Mitchell, related a parable about a soldier in an occupied territory who is convinced by a stranger that he, the stranger, is the leader of the resistance. The stranger is seen sometimes helping the resistance, at others he is seen handing partisans over to the police. Still, the soldier's faith is steadfast. Vance writes, and this is a slightly long quote, sometimes his friends, in exasperation, say, well, what would he have to do for you to admit that you were wrong and he is not on our side? But the partisan refuses to answer. He will not consent to put the stranger to the test. He does not allow anything to count decisively against the proposition, the stranger is on our side. This is because he has committed himself to trust the stranger. But of course he recognizes that the stranger's ambiguous behavior does count against what he believes about him. It is precisely this situation which constitutes his trial of faith. Mitchell, Vance concludes, articulated a faith I had never encountered personally. Doubt was unacceptable, unquote. So what kind of trial does the soldier's faith endure? Crucially, the parable is really an analogy. The stranger represents God, the soldier a believer. In other words, the faith in question is not the kind one places in other people. The soldier cannot fail his trial of faith so long as he accepts the stranger's claim to leading the resistance, irrespective of the evidence of his senses or the opinions of his fellow soldiers. And so we begin to see how his faith is not necessarily historical or empirical, but closer to something metaphysical. His commitment is not to the stranger's actions, but to the character he has assessed as true. This truth can only hold by eliminating doubt from belief and remaining impervious to the world, to the evidence of the empirical world. Note how closed, how internal this scene is. The soldier's view of the truth is determined purely by a conviction within him, a conviction unaffected by the world or the views and opinions of those around him. Although he lives in society, and although wars are fought in one way or another in defense of some idea of society, the soldier's life, indeed his existence wholesale, is sequestered from other people. The trial of his faith does not require the endorsement of society, and the authority so secured does not derive its legitimacy from society. The kind of faith the stranger demands makes the problem of knowing and being with others irrelevant. Note the difference between the way I was trying to set things up and how Vance has it. For Vance, the stranger does not raise a question about knowledge. He provides evidence of faith. And he does so by eliminating doubt from belief. The soldier does not need to accept the limits of what he can know about the stranger, because in unquestioningly accepting his authority, the soldier cedes all claim to knowing. To trust, one need not know. Or, to know anything, one need only trust oneself. The commitment Vance demands is therefore centered fully on oneself, on one's ability to authorize the grounds of their own thoughts, to confirm their own hermetic processes of thinking as examples of reasonableness, of reasoning about the world. If the protocols of thinking freely demand at a minimum an ability to question one's assumptions, then this kind of faith can only lead to a dogmatism, to an anti-thinking that mimics the protocols of thought while subverting their basic demands. And the primary subversion performed by this model that I'm interested in now is the erasure of other people in one's coming into knowledge. And I insist on referring to such commitments as philosophical not because they're especially sophisticated, but because they are the building blocks precisely of a worldview. My sense increasingly is that the stakes of a xenophobic worldview are neither to be found in the realms of materialism nor culture. More than a cultural politics, philosophical commitments are structural principles, offering an orientation that gives the world coherence and consistency, that gives it durability. Xenophobic ideologies flourish and are made possible by and in a world where the exchangeability and equivalence of ideas, persons, and things has become the norm, where difference is eroded into likeness and heterogeneity is obliterated. By the principle of one person, one vote in politics, the idea of common humanity in philosophy, and piety is about allyship, privilege, and community in society. Cultural politics and their representatives like J.D. Vance may change. Philosophical commitments are more recalcitrant. Without such commitment, everything is realpolitik.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Bregham.
So, first I would like to thank Hung-chiung and his amazing team for organizing this workshop. The workshop has been run seamlessly, and I see so much thought put into every aspect of the conference. So thank you for fostering the space for us to gather together, think out loud, and to reflect on the contemporary condition of the 6G, genesis, generativity, gender, genetics, genealogy, and genocide that we are living within today. I'm honored to participate in this double forum today, and since the prompt for the workshop is to provoke, that is to offer food for thought, I chose an article that made me think, ouch, but it kind of made sense. It's uncomfortable, but it might just be what we need. And the title of the article, it's not up here today, is by Drolette and Williams, From Critique to Reaction, The New Right, Critical Theory and International Relations, from Journal of International Political Theory. Now, this of course is a hunch, but in this short presentation I want to share with you what made me think this might be a provocation appropriate for today. So today I want to think about skepticism, critical thinking, and how the Enlightenment approach towards a new right, something which the Democrats tried was emphasis on good journalism, sharing the truth, doing the right thing, giving the voice to the minorities and those in less powerful position, is too proper, too prim and proper. This year, 2024, is the election year where 64 countries, which amount to a total of 49% of the population in the world, went to the polls. Taiwan had an election, the United States had an election, Japan had an election, India had an election, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, Mexico, Iran, and the United Kingdom, South Africa, South Korea, just to name a few. For many, this has also been the year where the US-led liberal world order has been cast under increasing scrutiny with the re-election of Donald J. Trump, leading commentators to reflect on the role of digital technology, social networks, as well as a surge of populism, which fundamentally distrusts the institution of the liberal world order. For the past few months, I have been listening to the New York Times podcast to listen to the mixture of slowly burning anxiety, coupled with an unhealthy dose of arrogance towards Trump supporters. So my point of reference is going to be more about the United States, although also combined with my reflection on the ongoing attack on higher education, which is an attack not limited to the United States, but also in the Netherlands. And what I think the panicking academics and Dutch higher education is also getting it wrong. There is a widespread sense of crisis. This distrust of the institution is not only targeting the state institutions, but also that of higher education. In the realm of higher education, this year has been the year when wokeness has become a target of scrutiny. The Cambridge Dictionary defines wokeness as, quote, a state of being aware, especially of social problems such as racism and inequality, end quote. The ability to problematize and see the structural inequality, racial injustice, is an ability which is fostered in higher education through the cultivation of critical thinking. Yet these have come under incessant attacks through various means, including defunding. Defunding of the humanities and the neoliberal universities' administration's demand for students to be equipped with transferable skills that are useful signals a bleak future where quick, quantifiable output is celebrated while the value of thinking, an act which is inherently destructive, as Hannah Arendt once wrote, is devalued. There are so many demands for solutions and quick fixes, little patience for matters which takes time. The Netherlands, where I'm teaching at, is also not an exception to this worldwide trend. This is to say that there is something about the faculty of thinking which evades the neoliberal ethos of and language of productivity. While it is tempting to formulate the contemporary condition as that of the good critical thinker against the evil populist, as a provocation in this talk today, I would like to focus on the disruptive aspect of critical thought. I focus on the term destructive because I would like to think about how this destructiveness is not monopolized by the critical thought alone. Destructiveness is also a feature of conspirational thought. What do I mean by this? Both critical thinking and conspirational thinking refuse to stop at the surface level of the realm of human affairs. Both refuse to take the word of the state at face value. Both seek to denaturalize and to politicize. Joseph Masco and Lisa Wedeen characterize the proximity of critical and conspirational theory as follows, quote, in the university circles, these interpretive logics inform what is still called critical theory, designating a mode of professional practice seeking to move beyond mere appearances to discern the structure of politics, economy, and communication in an effort to render them less conducive to structures of oppression across the lines of race, class, gender, or geopolitics. The critical aspect of theory in this formulation lies then in the imperative to activate readers, mobilizing an analytical narrative to reveal the structural inequalities within an existing social order, in the hope of altering its future condition. The implicit assumption of critical theory is that the most powerful forms of violence are loaded into the everyday, built into infrastructures of production and consumption, language, governance, and media, institutions and identitarian categories. It is in this way that they are rendered naturalized and occluded, made into powers that determine people's prospect from behind the scenes. Their effects are intense but also hidden, networked and powerful, which is to say properly, conspirational, end quote. Masco and Wedeen, pointing to the etymology of conspiracy as meaning to breathe together, argue that both critical and conspirational thinking have a fugitive form, a fugitive seeking to overturn the status quo, that is, the world as we find it. Both conspirational and critical thinking hegemonic understanding of the world by connecting distant dots into a sketch, into a narrative, a story that enable one to make sense of the world. To be sure, the two are not identical, yet the skepticism or the paranoid reading have proven to be a powerful destructive weapon, a tool developed in critical thinking, which have come to be appropriated by the new right. What I'm trying to move away from here is attempting casting of the critical educated elite versus the ignorant, uneducated mass, but instead think of the contemporary predicament as a result of the success of critical thinking and success of progressive institutions for providing a language with which to attack and destroy everything, including the very same progressive institutions. As Pippa Norris writes, the cultural revolutions of the 1960s had succeeded in reshaping the institutions. As Jorlet and Williams argued, quote, the move expressed a shared conviction that the cultural revolutions in the 1960s had succeeded in politicizing all spheres of human activity. The parliamentary debates and governmental policies would from now on merely conform the results of the cultural wars, and that the egalitarian principles of the left had become hegemonic in practically all civil society, state, and international institutions. Under these conditions, new writers concluded that the only viable strategy to challenge the cultural power of these adversaries was to turn the ideology critique of the left against its own universalist categories and egalitarian common sense. End quote. The new right have regrouped to form a counter-hegemony against the hegemony of the left by drawing the line as such. The new right uses the term new class in a similar way to designate the growing social stratum of experts, ranging from corporate executives to university lecturers, lawyers, computer programmers, and bureaucrats who occupy positions of economic and political power in the post-industrial information society. This is to say that we need to take the thinkers of the right, far right, seriously. This is a counter-enlightenment movement informed by the critique of modernity, capitalism, state power, and its technologically mediated permeation into the everyday. And I believe the acknowledgement of this correctness of this analysis of our contemporary predicament is an important one. We cannot address a global surge of the right by our habitual move to elucidate truth, to unpack that which is covered beneath the surface. These are all modes of enlightenment thinking, which at its base assume that there is a possibility that knowing is key. This response to disinformation or absurd claims about immigrants eating cats cannot be dealt with a quick call from the mayor or the leader of the community to correct with factual truths. This is something which we need to think about as not a matter that is possible to deal with the Enlightenment move. I say this because such move cannot strategically work with someone who knowingly does something, knowingly vote for a leader, knowingly look away. And this is where I find the approach to the act of knowingly acting otherwise as something which, and I am here inspired by Masco and Wedin on their recent edited volume on conspiracy theory and critical thinking, to take this as a survival tactic one deploys. We live in an age of epistemological uncertainty, as we are all actors, not just spectators, but actors acting a part that is partially in time with limited information, and an utter lack of gift of hindsight. We do not know, but we must somehow maneuver. We must connect the dots amidst the mist and the storm, and tether ourselves to some kind of narrative. And this search for a way to connect the disparate dots to find meaning and sense-making out of these is a move which both conspirational and critical thinking shares as its basis. Where truth is too exhausting to look for, where information is everywhere and somehow also nowhere, we are all flooded. We yearn for a big picture and an answer and a story. So the approach where one divides the realm of righteous thinking and the realm of messy human affairs mired in errors, wrong, rights, and to prescribe the response to those looking at the shadows in the cave as casting a flashlight at the cave does not quite cut it. It at least is not the best strategic move, I would say. So here are my questions. Can we acknowledge the predicament, how we are all overwhelmed with a world which seems to be unraveling day by day, an acceleration of climate change, those having to decide in a flick of a second whether to flee the street or not, that this paranoid reading of the world, this skeptical attitude, is also that which makes us human. Does it critique that critical seers have gained a position of power and comfort in higher education and give a semblance of adversality to legitimate the status quo, not prompt us to push our thinking further? I end my provocation, so thank you.
It's my pleasure and privilege to be part of this ATN, and my talk today is a very preliminary reflection on the man-machine merging through Slavoj Žižek, Hegel in the wire brain. So, in his 2005 book, The Singularity is Near, futurist Ray Kurzweil provides that our civilization will expand outward, turning all the dumb matter and energy we encounter into sublimely intelligent, transcendent matter and energy. So, in a sense, we can say that the singularity will ultimately infuse the universe with spirit. So, Kurzweil's singularity is now looming ever closer as Neuralink. A neurotechnology company founded by Elon Musk and 8 other scientists. And here is their website. So the company has obtained an FDA breakthrough device designation and received approval to begin recruitment for its first-in-human clinical trial of a fully implantable wireless brain-computer interface, often acronymized as BCI. So while the current BCI model is designed to enable people with paralysis to control external devices with their thought, Musk has openly stated that Neuralink's ultimate goal is to merge biological and artificial intelligence. In contrast to the optimism of Kurzweil and Musk, Hegelian philosopher Slavoj Žižek exercises extreme caution when confronted with the notion of the wire brain and its ideological extrapolation named singularity. With Musk's BCI chip in mind, Žižek defines the wire brain as a direct link between our mental processes and the digital machine, a link that enables us to trigger events in reality with a mere thought at the cost of allowing the digital machine to read our mind. Although Musk claimed that in his version of BCI, the individual is not totally immersed in it, you have to actively consent to it, to will it. Žižek nonetheless exposes the problem of Musk's defense. But how does Musk know that an individual will maintain this minimal distance? Remember that BCI works objectively. Our brain is wired, linked to a machine which doesn't read our thought, but the processes in our brain which are the neuronal correlate of our thought. Consequently, it is not much more reasonable. Is it not much more reasonable to surmise that when I am plugged into BCI, I will not even be aware when my inner life is transparent to others. So, what Žižek tried to highlight here is that the BCI would process neuronal data in our wire brain prior to the emergence of thought, and thus could bypass the censorship mechanism of our conscious mind. Even more unsettlingly, the BCI could manipulate our decision-making by interfering with the neuronal processes and leave us under the illusion of free will, completely unconscious of such manipulation. In Žižek's word, what we find here is a kind of Freudian counterpart to Benjamin Libet's famous experiment about free will. Even before we consciously decide, the appropriate neuronal processes are already underway, which means that our conscious decision just takes note of what is already going on, adding to a superfluous authorization to a fate I don't believe. So Musk, Kurzweil, and other proponents of the wire brain indeed combine the common sense notion of ego with vulgar naturalism. But for Žižek, the biggest problem lies in their narrow and misleading notion of being human. Underneath their discourse of technological utopianism, Žižek detects an uncanny 21st century iteration of the USSR's biocosmism, as you can see here. That is your poster. whose goal was to create an earthly paradise through the development of modern science and technology. In this biopolitical communist fantasy, not only humans but also animals, all living beings, would participate in the directly collectivized reason of the cosmos. So now, if we return and re-examine Kurzweil's notion of singularity, we would find his utopian picture of a post-human future in ways consistent with at least some conception of God. More explicitly speaking, Kurzweil seemed to fantasize about the reversal or overcoming of the fall of man. Namely, humankind regained his prelapsarian status by merging with AI and approaching singularity. Michael Zimmerman reveals that Michael Zimmerman reveals that technological post-humanists, whether wittingly or unwittingly, draw upon the long-standing Christian discourse of theosis, according to which humans are capable of being God or godlike. However, Zizek ridicules such a delusion of grandeur and desire to evolve into the post-human or transhuman species of Homo Deus, Homo Deus, God-man. So, in line with Hegel's argument, Zizek contends it is the fault that makes mankind like God in the first place, as God acknowledges in Genesis 3:22 that man is become as one of us to know good and evil after their act of transgression. In lectures on philosophy of history, Hegel addresses the conundrum, that is, why the acquisition of knowledge leads to the fall of man, by analogizing paradise to a zoological park where only brute animals, not man, can remain. For the brute is one with God only implicitly, not consciously. Only man's spirit has a self-cognizant existence. This existence for self, this consciousness, is at the same time separation from the universal and divine spirit. If I hold to my abstract freedom and the extraposition to the good, I adopt the standpoint of evil. The fall is therefore the eternal mythos of man, in fact, the very transition by which he becomes man. So I found Hegel's zoo analogy particularly interesting because when Marx warns that those who refuse to join the supermind of AI will soon become like gorillas in the zoo, the post-human zoo Marx envisioned seemed to be the opposite of Hegel's prelapsarian zoo. For Marx, the current model of human communication through lossy natural language will succumb to the lossless transmission of BCI-aided consensual telepathy. In his own word, there are a bunch of concepts in your head that then your brain had to try to compress into this incredibly low data rate called speech or typing. That's what language is. Your brain has executed a compression algorithm on thought, on concept transfer. And then it's got to listen as well and decompress what's coming at it. If you have two brain interfaces, you could actually do an uncompressed direct conceptual communication with one another. Yet for Hegel, a thought true content actualizes itself only through its linguistic expression. Prior to this expression, it is nothing substantial, just a confused inner intention. When speaking, we only learn what we want to say by effectively saying it. So in other words, we think in word. In other words, human language may be a lossy system that obfuscates our communication and cognition, but human subjectivity results from this very linguistic failure. We endeavor to verbalize ourselves. This verbalization fails, and our subjectivity emerges as a consequence of this absolute recoil. So the most catalytic manifestation of such linguistic failures, of course, is slip of the tongue, or lapsus linguae, which, according to Christian theology, reflect the post-lapsarian fissure between our material body and the material mind. For one last time, the lapsus leads us back to Kurzweil's singularity, a metaphor he borrows from mathematics. So the term singularity denotes a value that transcends any finite limitation, such as the explosion of magnitude that results when dividing a constant by a number that gets closer and closer to zero. As you can see, that is the singularity. So the mathematical singularity was then adopted by actual physicists to describe the point of apparently zero volume and infinite density at the center of a black hole. So therefore, Kurzweil's peculiar word choice of singularity to refer to the man-machine merging seems, in a sense, a lexus linguae that betrays a death drive. To merge with AI is to leap into a black hole that consumes every bit of information and to freefall into the impossible singularity. So while free-falling into such a black hole had nothing to do with free will, of course, we can still escape before crossing its event horizon. However, as Shijie pointed out, like a cartoon cat running off a cliff, we find ourselves free-falling only when we look down and notice the abyss. Thank you.
So now the floor is open. Welcome questions. Okay, David. David.
Thank you.
It's working.
Thank you very much. Terrifically interesting panel. So my question is posed principally for Anirban and Hitomi. But I think all the others can speak to it as well. Anirban, you premise your really compelling argument on the calling into question of the authority of expertise, and in a sense that then leads to a kind of institutional questioning, right? That has the authority of expertise at the center of it. And I wonder if there's not a more kind of, call it dialogic, kind of relation between the institutional authority of modernity and the authority of expertise that is at the center of it, in the sense that the institutions of and inherited from modernity no longer so readily apply to and service the kind of world that we've come to inhabit, in a sense structurally, not simply because of the development of AI and so on and so forth, but also demographically driven, right? The kind of movements and migrations, the interactions, the fact that the European derivative population historically of the global north is roughly 11% of the demography of the world. Right? And so there's a much more complicated sort of understanding that the institutions of modernity, born out of that kind of colonizing moment, so to speak, no longer are applicable and no longer are capable of, for want of a better way of putting it, serving the kind of complexity now in play, and higher education not among the least of it, to say the least. Everybody else. So I just wonder whether there's a need for a kind of, not just an institutional critique, but a kind of historicized understanding of the failures of our institutions in relation to the underlying structures.
Could I just follow up on that question, because I had a similar question for Anirban. I was wondering if we shouldn't distinguish between, you said the authority of expertise rather than which is in crisis or undermined. Isn't it more the authority of technocracy? And although it's often used as a synonym for expertise, there's been a concerted effort in SES studies since the 90s to articulate expertise in contrast to technocracy. And technocracy corresponds to, the swamp, and that's got to be drained. Because technocracy gives rise to elites entrenched in the political, as opposed to expertise, which is people coming in punctually for a single issue. And often in canvassing expertise opinion, one tries to get a broad representation of the political spectrum. So I just was curious about whether you thought about expertise as opposed to technocracy as the problem following from what David said.
Mostly we could continue this conversation later. I think it's too big for me to answer in a general sense, but I think what you're helping me pin down is, I didn't want to get very specific, but I think the way that I find this helpful to think is precisely not just historically, but through the context. And so if I were to kind of, if I were to respond to it in that vein, I would say that I'm kind of and I'm still working this through, but I'm persuaded by an argument that Gary Dorsal, the historian, made recently in his book on the rise and fall of neoliberalism, where he basically says that the US political order was organized in such a way that it's intricately organized to keep the kind of kookiness that is at the center to the fringes. And there is a very complicated architecture to that he lays out. And one of the things he sees changing is the way that precisely that institutional space is now being taken over by the people who were at the fringes. And the mechanism of relegation is what is crumbling. And I think that goes somewhat to the point that you're raising, and maybe the point Bregham is making. So I think that's kind of one, and then one can kind of unpack and elaborate that. I think I liked, and I think in some of the projects that I've done before, we kind of interested in that SDS mode. I think but there's still an assumption. I think what is interesting to me really is the kind of question of thinking and the unreasonableness of thinking as a form. And I think I'm not sure that even like a Michel Canon version, it becomes a network idea that's outside. I'm not sure how you go inside through that. I feel like there was something else.
So, thank you for your question. This is something I'm still muddling through in terms of questions about what is authority, what is expertise, where are things coming from, and yeah, because there's a lot of, I think we shouldn't conflate technology with expertise, and do we mean by expertise like, university lecturers are also expertise in a certain way, right? Yeah, and in a way, I was presenting today's thinking in relation to my earlier project about politics of history in Japan, because one of the things that I was thinking was about, well, how to decolonize knowledge production and how to wrest, the past away from the control of the state. How do we give voice to the minorities and the victims of imperial colonial practices? But one of the thread and one of the things I was thinking was about how there's a certain disturbing similarity between Dipesh Chakrabarty's provincial life in Europe with a Kyoto School discourse about overcoming modernity in 1930s. Because, yeah, it is decentering the current center, but are you becoming a sovereign subject yourself, right? And does that not replicate the same kind of violence that you are seeking to critique? Right? And I feel like the current new right is, in a sense, making that similar sort of move about, well, aren't you, right, the former marginalized, now at the center, right? And there's a kind of a move, and I sense a kind of repetition, right, in terms of, well, how does this mode of critique actually, right, not really get to the core problem that we are having today? So yeah, that's my really unformulated thought at the moment. But yeah, it's something that I think this one can really work on.
Just to add one line on the demography and institution question, I think I've been thinking it might be interesting to rethink the history of US institutions as trying to create settler consensus that is informed by whiteness but not restricted to it. And I think that's part of the mix of what is going on.
Can I just make a plug for one meeting, which is we'll be working on the strategies for the Irish English.
Thank you. I want to respond to Mr. Agus' talk, but I think I want to ask to everybody that want to respond to this. So I see that it's quite interesting that AI can be seen as a tool of colonization, and it also has some similarities with the past colonization tools. Like if we don't use it, someone who uses it will be superior to us. And seeing this, do you think that AI should be controlled by an institution? And if so, who should do it and how? Should we just give it to the company, or should state do it first, or should we wait for an international organization's decision?
Well, that's exactly the questions, how to democratize the AI process of making. So, because it's now on the hand of on a group of people with financial but also intellectual capacity, and there is a danger really of this new type of dominating or domination. So we can think of a more space for perhaps the production, the making of the tool, but also possibilities of more open knowledge system. So AI is not ideologically free, so it's really connected to what's behind the input and output, and also the processing of information is kind of a one-sided in nature, and it is still in the process of, I think, of being made perfect. So sometimes I am making jokes, if you criticize AI too much, then you actually are helping the companies to improve the tools, because it will be more and more perfect in collecting information. But we try to see the contextuality. So sometimes we see students creating an essay by using the AI, but it is not specific, it is not context-based. If you put a case on the ground, then AI cannot do anything. So far, but in the future, it's not impossible that everything on our daily life in a very with a very high context-specific nature will also be incorporated into the AI as a tool. So, but how the process is taking place is a question, and well, that is really a challenge, because then a new type of colonization will take place, also in the knowledge production, if it is under the control of a company of certain group of people.
Thank you. And I think, Hitomi, you opened up this question, but it's for everyone. So, there are two texts that bounce back to what all of you were saying. You know, in 2003, Latour writes this piece, his critique Run Out of Steam, very relevant piece, where he argues that essentially critical thought is debunking matters of fact rather than advancing on matters of concern. This is an exhaustion of this whole critical tradition. The second is a very old book by Luke and Boltanski, The New Spirit of Capitalism, that Stigler also criticizes, where he argues the movements of the 60s opens up for network-based organizations and opens the space for neoliberalism, right? Through notions of critical, overturning the order, etc. So that's a structural argument. The first is a philosophical. So one question I want to ask is, has critique actually run out? What does it mean to be critical in a university? This is a problem we face all over the world. Do we just get into the citational excess? Do we ask ourselves what is a critical questioning position? Because everyone is critical, including the right. So that's the educational question for me. And do we place ourselves outside that because we are part of the world? So this is a kind of large. I think students and teachers face this every day. So this is a kind of update to Latour's question. Has critique run out of steam again?
Yeah, thank you. And this is also something I think a lot about. And of course, university education's mantra is, right, and it's in our syllabus, right? The learning objective is to foster critical thinking, right? We all put it, right? But what does it mean if everyone's doing it, right? And for me, I don't have a good answer, but my hunch is that we should always be uncomfortable. That we shouldn't have this intellectual smugness and covered in those citations citing dead old people, right? Sorry, not to, but saying like, hey, what I'm saying is also valid because, right? But instead of taking cover in the comfort of citation, which reinforces existing knowledge power formation, right? Mostly produced in the global north and applied in the global south, right? But to keep on pushing and I think, the critique by the new right about the critical theorists is kind of true, right? We all need to fly in here today, right? And we have the privilege of taking a few days away from our teaching to come and gather, and which I love, right? And I'm really thankful for. But it's not a privilege that everyone has, right? And despite our grad school moments of not being able to afford food and all that sort of stuff, right? We are in a privileged position. And so I feel like, we shouldn't kind of feel like, okay, now that I found a job and we are in the position of university teachers and, talking about critical thinking that, I feel like we kind of forget what it means to not be there. And so, yeah, for me, I feel like the piece I, was referring to today, I really thought, ouch, yikes, right? But it's also kind of true in a sense, right? So how do we stay with this discomfort? And how does that make us, not feel comfortable enough to think, oh, I'm citing Zizek or Deleuze, and I am my day-to-day by being a proper critical intellectual, right? But to think, it doesn't mean much on the street, right? How do we really think about what's happening today globally, right? Without, resorting to our academic credentials, but to really think on the ground. So.
Okay, just take one question.
This might be rather basic. This is a question for Dr. Kuyama. And I was really interested in your discussion of critical thinking versus conspiratorial thinking and how they share very similar features, such as critiquing the existing structure and seeking underlying biases and authorities and so on. I'm curious about where exactly you draw a division between the two and consider their similarities. Does it lie in critical thinking, as you were just saying, it's a feeling of discomfort and it's critiquing like your own position and that sort of imposition of sense of discomfort which conspiratorial thinking might lack or be based around a sort of victimhood identity, or do you see other features that like clearly distinguish one from the other?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and that kind of resonated a lot with what I was, kind of thinking through, because there is a kind of disturbing similarity between conspirational and critical thinking, right? And if critical thinking is about discomfort, right, not taking things for granted, looking at the surface, going beyond the surface, right? One of the things that some mentioned, right, if we are too self-critical, we keep on deconstructing and thinking, well, are we not doing enough? We are always constantly criticizing what we also say, right? The difference between that and conspirational thinking is that there's not much self-doubt in that sense. As far as these things are wrong and this should be done. Whereas critical thinking constantly questions even the moment when we think, well, this is wrong, but, well, are we really entirely right and in the right position to even dare to claim that we are and we should check our privileges at the door, right? There's a kind of like a paralysis in a sense where we kind of, I'm not saying we to include everything, maybe it's just me, right? I'm thinking like, well, am I okay, right? But one of the things that William and Jorlet mentioned is that there's no like sense of, like discomfort in the new right? There's a make America great again. We have an ideology, we have a movement, let's go, right? Whereas we are constantly like, well, should we be always check, right? So that's my hunch. So thanks very much.
But I suppose it makes conspiratorial thinking extremely political, doesn't it? So it's not interested in dialogue or opening up a space that can tolerate alternatives. But I was also wondering, in that critique of, or the critique that conflates conspiratorial thinking with critique, it seems to be a particular version of critique that is being targeted there, especially when it's about a critique that wants to reveal structures behind appearances. But if you take sort of a structural thought in this respect seriously, I suppose what it's saying is it's the appearances that we have to now critique, but also the idea that there are structures that can give us a grounding for truth to critique those experiences are themselves problematic. So then the critique becomes more a process, a never-ending process, as you say, that the discomfort is articulating alternatives and then questioning ourselves about how we've come to articulate those. So that self-reflexivity. And so maybe it's also a question of the effect of politics that conspiratorial thinking is addressing or playing into, as opposed to a form of politics of truth, which I think we wouldn't hold to, but a politics of perspective or affinity politics, to use the Arroway's idea that we talked about briefly yesterday.
Enough, so I hope that the conversation will continue as we move forward. So let's keep our hands